Kia ora, and welcome to this month's Memia Podcast discussion with New Zealanders doing amazing work shaping the future. My name's Ben Reid. I'm the author of the weekly Memia newsletter covering emerging tech, new ideas and thinking about the future. You can subscribe for free at https://memia.substack.com. Today, I'm joined from the UK by New Zealander Lyndon Burford, who's a global expert on nuclear disarmament and deterrence. He's also a proponent of using blockchain technology to incentivize nuclear disarmament, which we'll get onto soon. Kia ora, Lyndon.
Kia ora. Good to be here with you. And let me just say, I'm a big fan of Memia, so thanks for the great work. And it's a real pleasure to be here with you.
To start this off, it's like in 2021, when we've got a sort of global climate crisis facing us down the barrel. And, behind that, a global ecological crisis that's really just so imminent. Then, why in 2021, why is nuclear disarmament still important?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think my starting point for discussing this with any general audience is, if you care about the climate crisis, and if you care about the COVID pandemic, and if you care about the global ecological crisis, you should care about nuclear weapons. Because although the sort of general political and media landscape doesn't focus on nuclear weapons, actually the nuclear crisis never went away. So the postures, the nuclear weapons postures, so-called, that existed at the end of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, which United States and Russia now, are exactly the same as they were in 1989. Both countries still keep maybe collectively a couple of thousand long-range missiles on, the terminology is a bit funny, but some people call it hair trigger alert, some people call it launch on warning alert. Basically what it means is that 24/7, 365, the world is never more than an hour away from full-scale nuclear war. Right. So that's half an hour away from launch of those couple thousand long-range nuclear missiles and an hour before they start landing on their targets. So that never changed. But then in terms of how does this issue relate to the climate crisis and global ecological crisis, etc., about 7 or 8 years ago, some researchers took the climate modeling software of the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, and they applied it to the hypothetical scenario in which there was a, quote, small regional nuclear war between India and Pakistan, in which each side used about 50 nuclear warheads for a total of 100 warheads. Mm. And using that modeling, they determined that if that hypothetical war were to happen, anywhere between 1 and 2 billion people worldwide would starve to death just from the climatic impacts of the war. So setting aside the immediate devastation of cities.
Nuclear winter that would come.
Nuclear winter. So basically what would happen is that the firestorms that would be created in dense urban areas would loft millions of tons of carbon and soot and ash and smoke up into the upper atmosphere because it's superheated. And so it will float up into the upper atmosphere. And then because at that height, the wind speed is really rapid, it would rapidly spread around the world and basically blanket the world in dust and soot. And that would lead to radical and almost overnight global cooling, which would impact growing cycles around the world, impact crop productions, all of your staples, your wheat, your rice, all of these things that feed the world. And they estimated that would kill between 1 and 2 billion people worldwide just from starvation. So that's setting aside immediate casualties, that's setting aside that there will be no ability to produce credible healthcare in those areas impacted.
Well, and the global economic collapse, and societal collapse that come from that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So that's just one sense of why I say, if you care about the climate crisis, you should care about nuclear weapons, because the climate crisis is actually making nuclear war more likely. Yeah. By causing flooding events in areas where people manage nuclear weapons, by causing mass migration that causes political instability that increases the likelihood of war and escalation. And in return, a nuclear war of any scale, even a small, quote, nuclear war, bearing in mind that those 100 weapons are sort of around about Hiroshima-sized weapons. The actual weapons that the United States and Russia have these days are orders of magnitude larger than that and more.
I mean, it's just such a stark reminder. Hiroshima happened, at the end of the Second World War, and Nagasaki. And, these are artifacts of history, and, how horrific they were. That destroyed entire cities and millions of people. And that was just two bombs, right? And then we've, even, I was sort of born in the 70s. And so that, the Cuban Missile Crisis was before I was born even. As far as the media interprets it, that's the closest we've ever been to a nuclear conflict. It's all sort of sat in the background of people's consciousness ever since. But in terms of the history, how come this does sit in the background of people's consciousness now, when, like you say, this is actually an imminent global catastrophe that is, sort of an hour away, in the way that you framed it there.
So, and I think at the end of the Cold War, a number of trends shifted and as a result shifted attention away from the nuclear threat. So the first thing was the Soviet Union collapsed pretty peacefully. And very quickly, the countries that had Soviet nuclear weapons left on their territory as a result of the dissolution of the Soviet Union returned those weapons to Russia.
So that was Ukraine, Belarus and Kazakhstan. Yeah. So the immediate tension that was the focus of the threat at the time dissipated pretty quickly. We had the unipolar moment of, the United States sort of running the world. And then at the same time, because that immediate sense of threat dissipated, all of the issues that had been hiding in the shadows, for example, the global ecological crisis and climate crisis that had been brewing whilst we were worried about nuclear weapons, emerged out of that shadow. And suddenly there were all of these critical issues that had gone unaddressed. And we started developing the broader ideas around what security actually means. What does it mean to have, climate security? What does it mean to have food security? What does it mean to have, human rights and all these human security type issues? And so a lot of people that had been focused on the nuclear threat switched their attention to these other critical issues. And then the other thing that happened was, out of that triumphalist moment of the West has won the Cold War, we perpetuated all of these myths, which we now are finding actually empirical archival research is telling us that they were myths. We perpetuated this myth that the reason that we haven't had an unwanted use of nuclear weapons was because of nuclear deterrence. And the reason that we prevented great power nuclear war is because we all had this system of making nuclear threats. So talk us through the game theory of that, of this concept of nuclear deterrence, because now in a much more connected, more multipolar world, it feels that everything is connected, and so there's no way that you can sort of have a nuclear deterrent, that only faces in one direction historically, but now it's facing into multiple poles.
Yeah, I mean that's the challenge we face. So if you're someone that watches this world and is interested in reducing the likelihood of nuclear war and reducing nuclear risks, as I am and many other people that also work in this field, you know that all of the trend lines in this area are in the wrong direction, all of them. So as you say, like during the Cold War, we had what was largely a bipolar confrontation that was kind of conceptualized between East and West, but it was very much driven by Russia at the center of the Soviet Union, by the United States at the center of NATO. The Russia at the center of the Warsaw Pact countries and the Soviet Union, center of that. And there was one weapons system that was considered to be, quote, strategic, and that was nuclear weapons. And so you had this bipolar situation with one weapon type that we were all interested in, quote unquote, balancing. What we have today is we have a multipolar nuclear world where there are 9 nuclear armed states, and that there are these multiple chains of deterrence where, for example, China will increase its nuclear missiles or whatever it's doing. It's building these missile silos these days because it's concerned about the United States. And so it's trying to deter the United States, but then that spooks India. So India feels like it has to develop some new nuclear weapons system, which spooks Pakistan. So Pakistan starts building more nuclear weapons. And this has been going on in this kind of cycle for a while now. And so you've got this multipolar arms race. You've got a whole
and yet, Pakistan is just across the border from China.
Yeah.
And so you're sort of dropping one on your own neighborhood, right?
I'm not going to pretend that this is sensible. I think it's all a little bit silly, to be perfectly honest. But there are many people who've built entire careers studying and perpetuating and also selling, quite literally, in the sense of making a lot of money out of these ideas. And that's an issue I want to come back to later.
Okay, yeah.
But in addition to the multipolar nature of the arms race, we also have multiple weapons types that are now considered to be strategic. So you've got nuclear weapons, but you also have highly sophisticated cyber weapons. You have hypersonic missiles being developed. You have artificial intelligence that's speeding up and complicating our systems of managing the weapons.
And the whole debate, I mean, I've sort of been involved in that ban killer robots conversation, and sort of lethal autonomous weapons. And the ultimate lethal autonomous weapon is an autonomous nuke. Well, nuclear technology is 50, 60, 70-year-old technology. And as I was seeing just online the other day, there's someone's put a machine gun on top of Spot the dog, the Boston Dynamics robot, right? And it's happening around us.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Israelis are pretty close, if they haven't already, to deploying drone swarms in the field, with over the horizon sight lines where soldiers don't even have to be in line of sight. They can just throw drones over the horizon and take out wherever they want. So that's battlefield type stuff. Yeah. So, I mean, that's the world we live in. And in that world, there are a whole new categories of nuclear risk where there are new vectors for escalating towards nuclear conflict. Yes. So that's going on as well. And then beyond all of that, as I said, there is this perpetuated myth that nuclear deterrence, which is this theory of, grossly speaking, people categorize it as mutually assured destruction, where if the West threatens the East, or if Russia threatens the United States and vice versa, then they are both incentivized to act, quote, rationally, which means with restraint, and they're both incentivized not to escalate out of fear of sparking what then becomes a nuclear war. And so the theory is that is what prevented an unintended use of nuclear weapons during the Cold War, and thus prevented also large-scale, major power war. And what we're actually finding now in the academic world, and by which I mean people that do multi-year studies in the archives of US and Russian and UK and French and Turkish archives, is that on multiple occasions, that simply was not true. On multiple occasions, we avoided the use of nuclear weapons out of pure luck. In some cases, that luck was that a system failed, and as a result of the failure of that technical system, the bomb didn't go off. In other cases, it was that humans in the deterrence loop deliberately disobeyed what they had been trained and drilled and ordered to do. And as a result of that disobedience, a nuclear weapon was most likely not used. So there's all of these situations that tell us, actually, so we have this idea in the public imagination that this threat-making system creates, quote, security. And what we actually find is that empirically, the evidence is now coming out of the archives to say, now, in some cases that may have been the case. In some cases, deterrence may have caused countries or leaders to act with restraint, but there are multiple instances in which it was pure luck, or it was pure disobedience of deterrence protocols.
I mean, there's the classic, story of the Soviet submarine captain, I think in the Caribbean, and was out of communication. Can you just remind us of that particular incident?
I mean, so as you said, right, the Cuban Missile Crisis is generally considered to be when we came closest to nuclear wars, 1962, October, and Kennedy kind of generally is in the historical retelling is told as this figure of great statesman-like leadership that steered us through, the narrow passage. And actually, again, what the archival evidence says, that he took radical risks, knowing that they were radical risks far beyond what he himself said were the United States' interests at the time. And not only that, but deterrence as a system assumes that we all have perfect information, that we know what the enemy's doing and thinking, that we can interpret their thinking correctly.
It's a game of chess metaphor, right? Which is absolutely not how the real world operates.
Yeah. If it's a game of chess metaphor, it's like a game of chess, except you don't know what the moves are, and you don't know what your enemy is capable of doing and is not with their pieces. And so, to give that example, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States underestimated the number of Soviet troops by a factor of, I think it's 2 or 3. Like they underestimated the number of Soviet troops on the island. They also didn't know, they assumed that the Soviet nuclear missiles on Cuba were not active. And in fact, they were active, deployed, ready to launch nuclear missiles. So the United States is acting, and Kennedy is making all of these aggressive moves on, for example, putting an embargo around the island, like blockading the island, on the assumption that the Soviets have very few troops on the island and they don't have active nuclear weapons. And in fact, it turns out that they had way more troops than the CIA was saying, and they had active nuclear weapons. Then beyond that, getting to the submarine example that you talked about, the American ships that were blockading the island started dropping depth bombs, or they weren't highly explosive, but they were designed to force the Soviet submarines in the area to surface. And again, they didn't know that the ships that were dropping these depth charges didn't know that the Soviet submarines had nuclear-armed torpedoes on them, and that they had permission to use the nuclear-armed torpedoes if they came under attack. So when these submarines started having depth charges dropped on them, the captain of one of these vessels wanted to use his nuclear torpedo to sink the American ship. And again, by luck, it happened that this was one of the lead vessels in the fleet. And as a result, it had the KGB political officer on that vessel. And the KGB political officer overruled the captain of the submarine and said, we're not starting a nuclear war because we're having a depth charge dropped on us, right? But there again, if that KGB officer had happened to have been on a different submarine, you had a Russian captain who had the technical capability, the legal permission from his country, and the intention to start a nuclear war, but he didn't, because we were lucky that that officer was on the vessel.
Complete, alternative history scenario.
The other thing, just one other critical point about that is that we only know that, what are we now, 1962, right? Like 6 decades later, and only because academics have spent years in archives dredging through this stuff to get it, and governments have done everything they possibly can to prevent academics getting it. So the knowledge that we have about these failures of deterrence and the luck that prevented nuclear war is despite massive secrecy and lack of accountability and desire to try and cover all of this stuff up. So what we're told in public is nothing at all like the reality of what is in the archives, but it's extremely hard to get that information. And we only learn about it decades later, 3, 4, 5 decades later.
It's quite phenomenal. It's definitely not front of mind. It's, of all of the issues that the media is discussing, and possibly that's deliberate. What's the current state of play with nuclear weapons around the world right now? So you were saying there's 9 armed states. How many weapons altogether, and what's the model upon which they're deployed?
Yeah, so there's, as you said, there's 9 nuclear armed states. So China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, the United States are the 5 that are recognized under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which aims to advance disarmament and prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. And then there are 4 countries that are not a member of that treaty, which is Israel, India, Pakistan, and North Korea. North Korea was formerly a member of that treaty and withdrew, and then developed nuclear weapons, or rather developed nuclear weapons whilst a member of the treaty, and then withdrew and tested those weapons. So there's 9 nuclear armed states. There's roughly 13,000 nuclear warheads still in existence. So that's more than enough to make the rubble bounce many times over, to use the Cold War analogy. And yeah, as I said, there's just far more potential vectors of risk and pathways to escalation via which those weapons could be used. So I guess the other thing I really wanted to come back to that I flagged before is this question of money. So we have this public perception that the politics of this entire area is governed by this rational strategic analysis and policy making based on nuclear deterrence, right? Nuclear threat making. And it's in my opinion, that's just a farce, because what it does is it completely ignores the question of money. So in my world, and as I said, I've been studying nuclear weapons for coming on 17 years, nobody ever talks about money in the policy world. You never say, where does that analyst work? You never ask who's paying the bills, because that's considered it's a dirty question. Like, what does who pays my salary have to do with my opinion about strategic weapons policy? I'm like, well, in my opinion, I grew up, my father always used to say, who said it and who do they work for? And the implication is like, who's paying their bills? Who's putting food on their family's table? And like in every other industry, that's a critical question, because we understand that money matters. And in this industry, what you have is and I say this advisedly because this is the phrase that the United States government used when it designed it. We have a permanent war economy. We have an economy in which war is a profitable business because it was deliberately designed that way by the United States following World War II. World War II, the United States came out of that conflict enormously wealthy because it had been manufacturing and selling guns to everybody, to all of its allies. And it saw that form of guaranteed income, guaranteed industrial output was an enormous driver of economic activity. So it deliberately created what it explicitly called a permanent war economy. Now, the result of that is that war's a profitable business. The result of that is that the companies that are involved in making weapons or servicing weapons industries, all of the service industries around that, has a lot of money. They offer highly paid, highly skilled jobs, which are obviously very sought after. And that brings with it both economic well-being, so wealth, political influence, because you've got a very wealthy, highly paid, high-profile constituency. And so that creates status. And so what you have is an economy in which wealth, political influence, and status are associated with making weapons. And in the nuclear context, just to take, again, the United States. Now, it may sound like I'm picking on them. The reason partly that I talk about the United States so much is because they are the most transparent. You can get the most information about their activities. So that's one of the reasons that I talk about them as an example. But in the United States, they have plans now to spend around $1.2 trillion over the next 25 odd years, renewing all of their nuclear weapon systems. And they're not alone. So all 9 of the nuclear armed states are either modernizing their nuclear arsenals or increasing the sizes of their nuclear arsenals, or both. And that's why I say we're now in a multipolar nuclear arms race. They're all building more weapons or better weapons or newer weapons. And so the reason for that is because it's, well, part of the reason I would argue is because it's profitable, because in that industry,
keeps the economy going. Yeah,
it does. And so there's incentives for, and again, I want to draw out the issue of incentives because we'll come back to that later on the issue of blockchain. In that world, the incentives for politicians and venture capitalists is to invest in weapons because they're very profitable, right? And because those industries have enormous constituencies around them that are great at lobbying politicians, donating to politicians, voting for politicians who support the war economy. And again, to take the example in the United States, the last 3 US presidents received major donations from companies that manufacture nuclear weapons.
I mean, it's just been amazing since the Afghanistan withdrawal, and now the sort of increased saber rattling, across the Taiwan Strait, almost the day after. And I remember there was the speech that Biden made, and so this is the first time in 20 years that the United States hasn't been at war. Clearly, like you say, it is a permanent war footing that they seem to be on.
And there is an enormous and a very powerful constituency that has deliberately been built over the years, which makes a lot of money out of that. Yeah. And so what I'm saying is strange in the nuclear context is there's almost no discussion about the fact that making nuclear weapons and therefore making nuclear threats is a profitable business, because that impacts what we are incentivized to do in our daily lives and who puts the food on the table for our families and all these kind of things. And I mean, where does New Zealand stand in all of that? I think Rocketlab is a perfect example of the permanent war economy. So I don't know how much the Memia sphere has followed the debates around it, but Rocketlab since 2013, I think it's 2013, it's about that time, has been 100% US owned. So it's not a New Zealand company, it's a 100% US owned company. It received $8.3 million from the Provincial Growth Fund last year to build a road to enable it to, make its activities more efficient. So you've got government investing millions of dollars in it. Now, and one of its most regular and reliable customers is the US military. It's multiple US military agencies.
Yep.
Now, they'll say we're not supporting weapons, but it's really hard to distinguish how we're not. So a great example is the Gunsmoke J. There was a payload that they launched in space for a US military agency that was called Gunsmoke J. According to that US military agency in its reports to the US Congress, the purpose of that satellite was to enable battlefield targeting by tactical commanders on the ground. So what you've got is a US-owned company getting money from the New Zealand government to expand its operations in New Zealand that's putting satellites into space.
As part of that whole supply chain, yeah.
And equally, and this comes back to the issue of nukes, and I've plenty of resources I can recommend your listeners to that actually go into this in some detail. I would argue it is technically impossible for the New Zealand government to guarantee that what we're putting into space now for the US military is not in future going to be used to help target US nuclear weapons. There's no technical capacity to guarantee that. The New Zealand government will say, no, we're not doing that at all, and it's all by the book. But there's an advisory committee that advises the Prime Minister. It's called the Public Advisory Committee on Disarmament and Arms Control. It was created in 1987 by the New Zealand Nuclear Free Zone Act. And that committee is made up of experts, non-governmental experts, academics, former military personnel, former diplomats, and they have a statutory mandate to advise the Prime Minister on the implementation of the Nuclear Free Act. And it's just come out in the news the last couple of weeks. That committee has written to the Prime Minister twice to express its expert collective concern that the activities of Rocketlab, there's no ability to say definitively, but they have significant concern that they may be contributing to a breach of the New Zealand Nuclear Free Zone Act. Now, the Attorney General has come back and said, fish, that's all rubbish. We're not knowingly doing any of that. But my point is, if the US military doesn't tell us exactly what is in the payloads, and the New Zealand government has limited ability to enforce that, then how do we know what's in those payloads? How do we know what software is going to be uploaded to them further down the track? And the answer is we don't. So if we don't know what's in the payloads, and the government will say, oh, we do know, but how do we know? Because the US military told us. Well, so are we now in a situation where it's acceptable that in order to not breach the New Zealand Nuclear Free Zone Act, we're going to trust the US military agencies, and bearing in mind, these agencies that are launching payloads with Rocketlab, a US-owned company, using US technology, are the same agencies that in other parts of their activities operate, develop, and maintain US nuclear weapons. Now, these agencies clearly have a vested interest in saying, oh, no, there's nothing to see here. Of course, we're not breaking your nuclear free law. But remember, who was most upset when New Zealand instigated the nuclear free law was the US military, because we were limiting their ability to send their nuclear weapons around the world by banning them in our internal waters. Yeah. So we're now in a situation where the only guarantee we have that the New Zealand government is not allowing Rocketlab to assist in the development of systems that could be used to target nuclear weapons is the word of the US military agencies who produce and manage nuclear weapons.
It raises the question, so New Zealand's relatively unique globally having this nuclear free zone legal status, right?
In some ways, we certainly weren't the first. There were other countries in the Pacific that beat us to it. Palau, I think Vanuatu had a nuclear free policy before us. However, we certainly were early, and we certainly are the only country that was a formal treaty ally of the United States ever to reject nuclear deterrence. So that was quite unique. But we also now are amongst a community of other countries that have signed the Nuclear Ban Treaty, or the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So that's a United Nations treaty. It was negotiated at the United Nations, entered into force this year. And New Zealand really led the charge on that with a bunch of other countries, South Africa, Austria, various others. And that treaty is a further step forward beyond the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which came into force in 1970, says that countries that don't have nuclear weapons will agree not to get them by any means. Countries that do have nuclear weapons, the 5 that I mentioned before, China, France, Russia, UK, US, they agree to work in good faith to disarm their nuclear weapons. And all countries agree to work to advance the peaceful uses of nuclear technologies. So what that treaty doesn't do is it doesn't outlaw nuclear weapons, and it doesn't outlaw the making of nuclear threats. And as a result, the UK, US, China, all those guys, they say, well, it's fine for us to have these nuclear deterrence policies where we threaten nuclear annihilation. You're all going to die, but we think it's in our interests, so we are going to claim the right to kill everybody if we think that serves our political interests. So there's a really huge moral risk there, right? You're effectively saying, I claim the right to end all human life in the name of my imagined political community. And if you don't think
my imaginary game of chess.
My imaginary game of chess. And if you don't think that that's imaginary, I'd say, well, hang on. The Soviet Union was the key player in this imaginary game of chess until 1990, 1991, right? Where it was threatening the entire world with tens of thousands of nuclear weapons. And then it just dissolved. And suddenly, all of this risk that the entire of humanity had been under in the name of this imagined political community called the Soviet Union, the community disappeared. So was the threat to annihilate all of humanity really a valid moral risk that we should be running?
I mean, it's worth just considering the breakup of the Soviet Union, because I mean, if you were in the 1990 and saying that in a couple of years' time that it will have peacefully dissolved, relatively peacefully, and there'll be this sort of monopolar global hegemony from the US, then no one would have believed you. And I there's certainly signals that I pick up potential for the US to maybe disintegrate. The next election, basically, you get a Trump type figure, but actually knows what they're doing, and actually with understands how to use the executive levers. Then that country could rapidly descend into some kind of civil war, right? And similarly with China, right? So the over centralization of China that's been happening, never underestimate the possibility of a fragmentation there, despite the narratives that we're constantly fed by our mainstream media. And so what were the mechanics when the Soviet Union broke up of management of the, and control of that nuclear arsenal? You were saying that it was spread across Russia and 3 other states. The major risk here is that as part of that fragmentation, one of these weapons basically makes the nuclear material makes its way into a non-state actor. At that point, the attack vectors that you've been describing just become, they don't become missiles, they become sort of suitcases and shipping containers, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a critical issue. Non-state actors, terrorists getting hold of nuclear material, as you said. Nuclear technology is like old school technology. It hasn't changed a lot since the first bomb was invented in 1945. The weapons designs are available on the dark web, easy as you like, and it's becoming easier and easier to get hold of the nuclear materials because the technology is advancing rapidly, and so it's easier to develop. There's new technologies being developed called, for example, laser enrichment, which the UK and I think South Korea and various other countries are developing. The hardest part of building a bomb is getting the nuclear material. And so once you've got that, even if you can't build a missile, as you say, if you can create a nuclear explosion or even a dirty bomb where you just spread the nuclear material widely, would create such panic and such chaos that it would be devastating. And so that material is becoming more widely available, more easily. And so, when you talk about the potential for state fragmentation, I mean, again, if you were to start predicting the demise of any of these great powers that you're talking about, you would be called crazy. But as you just said, if you had said in 1987, oh, look, give it a few years, this whole Cold War thing will have just blown over, Soviet Union will have dissolved peacefully, and all of the weapons will have been returned to Russia, that'll all be done, you would have been called a crazy person. And yet, there you have it, right? And it's that type of, the unknowability of the future is really undermines all of our theories about how stable and strategically logical and sensible the system that we live in is. It's really not. So yeah, the threat of state collapse, I mean, people generally in my world, they focus on the risk of that type of thing happening in Pakistan. Yeah. But as you say, I mean, when you look at the fact that you can have thousands of people storm the so-called home of democracy, right? Capitol Hill in Washington, riot, 6 people die, a cop is killed, and 1/2 of the political class won't even recognize it as a problem. Right?
Yeah, we look at it from the outside, and I think we're all relatively immune to America's self-narrative that drives a lot of this. But it definitely feels that the risk of a Trumpian figure emerging, without restraint, is definitely a scenario that I've got on my radar. So, switching gears here. So, I introduced you at the beginning as an expert in nuclear disarmament, but you're also an advisor on blockchain to, the Vatican's sort of commission on the future, right? So, how have you, I guess, moved into this blockchain world, and then what is the connection between, your work on nuclear disarmament and potentially blockchain technology?
I have been interested, as you said in the intro, in not just the politics of nuclear disarmament, but also the technologies. And so I look at this challenge of how are we going to reduce nuclear risks, including by reducing and ultimately eliminating nuclear weapons, not just as a political challenge, but as a technological challenge. And so in that regard, I approach the question from, in nerdy terms, what's called a techno-political perspective, which says the tools that you use are never neutral. So technology is never neutral. If you hear people saying that it's neutral, I would argue that that's mistaken. Technology is inherently political. It reflects the power structures of a particular society at a particular time. It reflects the norms and values of a particular society at a particular time. That determines the types of technologies that we choose to build and choose to adopt en masse. And then over time, those technologies impact on our political systems because particular technologies make certain types of behavior, certain types of policies easier. And because they make them easier, they make them more likely. And then what they do is basically the characteristics of the technology shape the way that humans think and act over time. And over time, that impacts on societal norms, values, and also hierarchies. So technology is inherently political. So I look at this question, I say, well, if you break down a nuclear weapon, what is it? It's a tool that is designed to cause indiscriminate, massive violence. And so as a political tool, what can you do with that technology? Well, you can either threaten massive indiscriminate violence, or you can enact massive indiscriminate violence. But as a policy tool, those literally are your 2 only options. Like if you're painting, if you're painting with nuclear weapons, your palette is either threaten or enact massive indiscriminate violence. Yeah. So it's a pretty limited palette, but once you start thinking in those terms, it locks you into those are your only policy options at the strategic level. I've been looking at blockchain. And
to your point on the economics of it earlier, at any cost. Right, at any economic cost, because strategically this is what we must do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because we don't talk about money, because money doesn't matter, because we're all rational beings. All leaders are rational. All leaders react rationally with the same rational logic in a crisis. So therefore, we can predict that everything's going to be fine. That's the theory behind it. So I've applied the same lens, this techno-political lens, to blockchain to say, well, what is blockchain? So blockchain is the technology that underlies Bitcoin, but Bitcoin is just one example of a blockchain. There are actually some 6,000 odd blockchains out there. And I would also add for listeners that are concerned about climate issues, of those 6,000 blockchains, very few of them use the same cryptographic mechanism that Bitcoin uses. And as a result, virtually none of them use anywhere near the same amount of electricity. Ethereum is close, but there's a whole range of blockchains out there that basically use negligible amounts of electricity, and therefore their carbon impact and their ecological impact is drastically lower
I mean, it's obviously the proof of stake work that's happening, that's being rolled out onto the Ethereum network over the next few months, as I understand it, is going to significantly reduce the carbon impact of that particular.
Yeah, they say about 99.5% of the energy footprint will be eliminated once you move to proof of stake. So, at any rate, I've been looking at blockchains and as systems for governance, for collective governance. What types of systems do they make possible, and how do those systems change the way we think about politics? And so I've applied that lens to this problem of nuclear disarmament. And basically, what I've said is, in the process of getting rid of nuclear weapons, most countries prefer to verify. So Reagan famously said trust but verify, which is actually a play on an old Russian phrase, "Doveriyai na proveriyai," which is basically the same thing, but he stole it from the Russians. Which is to say, you don't trust, when Russia says, okay, you get rid of 10 weapons, we'll get rid of 10 weapons, you don't trust that they've done it. You verify, you go and inspect the weapons, you inspect facilities. So how do you do that comprehensively when you're trying to collectively, multilaterally move towards disarmament? And I argue that in order to do that, you need very sound data records that people can trust. Because how do we know that Russia's not keeping its records and then changing them when we're not looking? And in that context, the so-called immutability of a blockchain ledger is a very powerful characteristic. So the ability to create distributed ledgers that everybody owns collectively and no one can change unilaterally.
And with what kind of security overlay there do you have in mind? So is this something that's open to any citizen of the planet, or is it really just kept secret to all of the holders of nuclear weapons?
So the way that I've imagined it is that you would have a public but permissioned blockchain. So it is a consortium blockchain, but the consortium would be made up at a minimum of dozens of different states and probably various other actors outside of that, and equally to include individual citizens. So the nodes on the blockchain would exist on a spectrum from full nodes, which is where nation states have access to the blockchain itself and to the data on it, right down to the low end where you would have light nodes operated by individual citizens and those nodes would be able to contribute to maintenance of the ledger, say contributing to consensus, but not have access to any of the underlying data. And then in terms of, you asked about security of the system, I'm not suggesting that we put data from verification exercises or practices, getting rid of nuclear warheads, the data from that exercise.
But just the fact that it was verified.
No, the hash of the report. So you would have countries eliminating warheads, signing transactions collectively, sort of multi-signature transactions from multiple different countries, attesting the fact that the warhead had verifiably been eliminated. And the hash of that report would be logged on the blockchain with metadata to the extent possible, minimizing the amount of metadata, whilst also giving confidence that you could track what was being done. And the metadata itself would be encrypted using homomorphic encryption and zero-knowledge proofs so that countries with the right permissions, that is, the states, could query the database to make sure that no one was changing it and that, keep track of how many weapons have been reduced, et cetera, over time.
You've jumped forward to a solution here, right? So, of all of the challenges that we've discussed so far, what are you fixing here? So what you're basically saying, there's an immutable record of disarmament.
Yes, but you're quite right. We've jumped around a little bit. One of the core reasons that I think that this is of interest is because using a blockchain, you can align the incentives of non-trusting parties in the absence of a central authority. So you can incentivize people or countries to cooperate economically, even if they don't trust each other. And so what I'm actually trying to do with this blockchain-based model for disarmament is invert the incentive structures of the permanent war economy and create a permanent peace economy. So if a permanent war economy is an economy in which it's profitable to engage in war or the development of weapons for war, a permanent peace economy is an economy in which peace is a profitable business, right? So by peace, I'm talking a very narrow definition here, which is the continuous verified enactment of commitments to reduce weapons numbers and not to build new nuclear weapons, right? So in other words, what I'm saying is you're verifying the absence of nuclear threats. And I'm defining peace as that process of verifying it.
It feels, it feels in some ways very similar to potentially carbon markets. I think recently the commentary from a whole bunch of central banks on the climate change crisis this is a massive market failure, right? Assuming that markets work in this rational way, but it is a massive market failure where the long-term risks, collective risks, and the disasters that are going to befall the world as a result of ongoing carbon emissions and methane emissions are they're not factored into the economy right now. Yep. And it would seem from your very opening statement about a nuclear winter, which from a small conflict affects potentially kills 1 to 2 billion people on the planet, and creates would just create economic catastrophe. It would seem that there's a similar market failure here in that by allowing a very small number of states globally, with big populations, but to hold this threat over the remainder of the world, there's a sort of market failure.
Yeah, nuclear weapons are worse than useless, right? Because they not only don't do what people claim they do, but in addition, they cause enmity, mistrust, and international alienation because we're all constantly threatening each other with annihilation. And as a result, they make it harder to create cooperation on the critical issues that we are facing, like the climate crisis, like ecological collapse, like mass migration, like global pandemics, which are situations where you need multilateral cooperation. And by creating constant alienation, othering, and mutual threats of nuclear annihilation, you make it incredibly difficult to get that kind of cooperation. And so they're worse than useless. They're exacerbating all of these other challenges as well. But yeah, I mean, to your point about the market, I'd say check out something just launched, which is called the Climate Collective, right. Which is a private version of the carbon coin concept, or something close to that, which is the Celo Foundation, which runs the Celo blockchain and has Celo USD and Celo Euros as stablecoins, is purchasing blocks of forest I think in the Amazon as a part of their asset backing for their stablecoin. And so what happens is, as more people mint the stablecoin, that money is transferred into purchasing more trees to lock them up and ensure that they remain a carbon sink. And so you've got a market mechanism whereby you're incentivized to use this stablecoin.
It amazes me that, that in many ways could be looked at as the biggest entrepreneurial opportunity that there ever was, right? Because from a reinsurance point of view, right, just insurers with a long-term capital that wants to maintain the value of its capital over 50 to 100 years really needs to be, thinking about the value of its capital in 2050, 2075, with 3 or 4 degrees global warming versus the value with 2 degrees. And then, so is it worth basically taking a hit for the next 20 years on your P&L in order to, be there at the other end? It would seem that similarly, what you'd be able to do with the nuclear disarmament verification, just having sensors out there around the world detecting nuclear isotopes, I suppose, is that something that's possible on there?
Yeah, I mean, the technology exists. So again, the idea of creating incentives is that you create micro incentives at the individual, the institutional, and the international level for countries to cooperate in verifying the absence of nuclear threats, nuclear risks. And one way that you do that is through the kind of really elite human-centered verification practice, on-site inspections of weapons laboratories or weapons facilities, etc. And at the other end of the spectrum, you've got remote automated monitoring. So, for example, instead of an IoT, you would have an IoVT, an Internet of Verification Things. And so that would be a global mesh network of remote sensors that monitor particulate matter, that monitor audio signatures of military transports, military trucks or jets or things like this. And they are trained to recognize the signatures, for example, of heavy bombers that carry nuclear weapons or particular trucks that are used to transport nuclear warheads. And over time, you build this global mesh and it reports automatically back to the blockchain. And on the blockchain, you have a system of smart contracts that have been coded with particular agreements about, okay, country X will remove all of these type of vehicles from this area, and that will give country Y confidence that they're not, developing some kind of attack plan. And then you deploy this mesh network of sensors, and they just sit there and they verify the absence of the sonic or the audio signature of those vehicles. And they just report back to the blockchain, and smart contracts on blockchain just constantly report, yes, they're in compliance, yes, they're in compliance, yes, they're in compliance. And as soon as there is a signature that's an anomaly, the smart contract pops up with a warning flag saying, hang on a minute, we appear to have an audio signature in this area that we shouldn't have. And that allows you to efficiently target your human resources to say, okay, let's send out a team of inspectors and see why it was there. Let's try and build some confidence that it was just an anomaly, or perhaps the sensor was malfunctioning, etc. And it creates efficiencies in the system as well. But it also, the other thing that it does is, at the moment, we have an absolutely booming, like a flourishing open source intelligence industry. That industry is by and large Western funded and Western populated. And as a result, all of the open source or OSINT is pointed at China, Russia, North Korea, these countries. In a world without nuclear weapons, that OSINT capability will be pointed at all of the governments of the world and all of their military installations. And so what we need is that, and that's what the economist calls the people's panopticon.
Yeah, I read that.
So it's that kind of model, but applied to a global nuclear verification system designed to verify the absence of nuclear threats and the absence of the development of nuclear threats. And by incentivizing that economically through micropayments built on a cryptocurrency, so you'd have, for example, verification coin as the native cryptocurrency of the GNV.
Right, I like it. Yeah.
And all participants in this system at every stage of the system and at every level would be incentivized by the opportunity to earn verification coin. And you might say, well, what value is that? Like, no one's going to value that. I'm like, sure, but when Bitcoin was first released, it sold for cents or microcents, Now it's worth $50,000. And the reason is,
going back to, my point that this is a 50 to 100 year play, right? You have one nuclear winter in the next 50 to 100 years, and any of your capital that you own today is going to be worth significantly less. And by the way, 2 billion people would die, right? So I'm not trivializing it, but from we talk about rational actors, but
we're talking about market economics, right?
Yeah,
so like that's the framework we're
there
looking
is at. That long-term incentive to do that. So it's an amazing concept that you've come up with here. Sort of really meshing, nascent new technology, decentralized markets and blockchains. So how are you progressing this to actually make it real and to get buy-in? So who else is talking about these concepts, and how, when you go into conversations with the US sort of nuclear military establishment and start talking about, well, I've got this idea about a blockchain for verification, is there a sort of translation challenge?
Generally, the response that I get from government officials when I've talked about this is no. That's the general vibe, is just no. That's no thing. There is some acceptance among certain officials of the fact that the immutability of the blockchain is a genuine innovation that offers significant potential in confidence building exercises. So there is recognition of that there is something unique and valuable here. but the ability to apply it in the disarmament context is pretty limited work has been done on that. There has been a reasonable amount of work done on the concept of nuclear safeguards, which is stopping the spread of nuclear weapons. So the Stimson Center has done a lot of work on this in the United States. Finland has built a full national scale prototype of a nuclear material accounting and control system built on a distributed ledger.
Right.
So it's a private permission ledger, but they're experimenting with that. Australia and the United States have built similar prototypes, although lower scale, not national level to the same degree. So there's a lot of research going on in this area around stopping the spread of nuclear weapons.
Yep.
There's very, very little around how this actually apply to disarmament.
Which comes back to your original point about the economic incentives to perpetuate the military-industrial, status quo. I've been very fascinated by the conversations, Balaji Srinivasan's sort of concept of a network state, bringing sort of almost unbundling nation states and distributing them, so just non-territorial states that exist, effectively in the metaverse. That is a disarmament actor. Yep, the pro-disarmament actor would be a network state who's with incentives for global disarmament, because they have no territorial, claims.
So the thing about that, I'm pretty skeptical of the whole Srinivasan thesis around the network state and exit, and here's why. He aims to create a network state, but his ultimate goal is to perpetuate the existing state, because if you look at the end of his thesis, he says, and then we create contiguous geographical land, and we've got our own state, and we'll probably have a military and a flag and our own currency. And I'm like, right, so you just recreated the state. And in that regard, one thing I'd say about, I kind of put that in the category of tech utopianism, and it's, in my opinion, it's a pretty sociological view of the world. It ignores humanity and thinks that technology is the solution to everything. So just to be clear, my work is deeply sociological. As I said earlier, all technology is political. When we're encoding any system, whether it's the system that I'm proposing or any other protocol, any other algorithm, we need to be deeply aware of our own inherent biases, because otherwise we end up with coded bias, right? Whether it's on racial or gender or any other set of parameters. Really highly recommend watching the film Coded Bias. It's excellent on this issue. And what Balaji Srinivasan's vision does is just say, well, we'll just code our way around the nation state as though geography doesn't matter. And I'm actually deeply skeptical of the idea that geography doesn't matter anymore, because all of your servers exist in a nation state. And in that nation state, we have this norm of sovereignty that says that the nation state is allowed to use violence against you if it thinks that you're doing something that's not in its interest.
Well, that's, the concept of a nation state, like you say, would need a defense capability, right? And
he said, I'm trying to think if I've heard him actually say the words military force, but certainly his thesis is we start by crowdsourcing the community online, then we collectively crowdsource them by parcels of land. Then over time, we join those parcels together to create a contiguous state. And at the end of the vision, all we've done is we've recreated the state, but with a cryptocurrency. So we've got a CBDC. And
a very low tax rate. Yeah.
And a very low tax rate. But then once you've got that physical nation state, then how do you enforce order? Well, you have a police force. Okay, well, what if your neighbors wants to steal, the food that you're growing? Well, then we need a military. Okay, well, now we're just back at the nation state again. So I'm pretty skeptical about that we're just going to create some blockchain utopia by recreating the nation state in the cloud first. And I think that, he's like a software engineer. He's a brilliant guy. The guy's a genius. There's no doubt he's a genius, full-blown genius. I'm not denying that. But he's a very technical thinker, and I think that a lot of his stuff is deeply unsociologically aware. That would be my take.
Excellent. So Lyndon, I guess, if we were just to, wrap up the conversation now, it's been just completely fascinating, and it's opened my eyes to a whole bunch of areas of sort of things happening around the world that just were beneath my awareness for my whole life, to be honest. So, you know, in terms of what you're doing next, and what, you know, what's your roadmap from here? What are the, you know, you're working with this Vatican Commission right now. What are the couple of, you know, key pieces of work that you've now got in the pipeline?
So I'm about to submit for publication a full draft of the global nuclear verification system.
Yep.
Which is, so that's kind of like the next key academic step, is to publish that. I'd like to start working on some public educational videos to talk around these concepts, to talk around the permanent war economy versus a permanent peace economy, etc. So, you know, as you mentioned at the top, I've a passion for film, worked in film, I've made a bunch of short documentaries and stuff. So I'd like to keep working on that. I'm working with the Vatican on their new technologies for peace working group within their COVID commission. The reason for that is because the current Pope he's passionate about social justice. He's passionate about environmental justice. He takes a very holistic view of the world, of human flourishing, of well-being and how it relates to environmental well-being, etc. And he's also a passionate advocate of nuclear disarmament. Yeah. So whereas his predecessors said, we don't really like nuclear weapons, but it's kind of a necessary evil, Pope Francis has come out and said, no, it's just an evil. It's not necessary. It's just an evil. And there's no legitimate reason to have or threaten or use or have anything to do with nuclear weapons. So they reached out to me when they saw, I published a paper last year on blockchain and nuclear disarmament verification. So that's already available on the King's College website. If you search nuclear disarmament verification and blockchain, I'm pretty sure it's, you know,
there's one paper.
I couldn't find anything else worldwide that had that in the title when I published it. And they found that and reached out to me and said, hey, we've got this new tech for peace working group. Our goal is to, instead of militarizing all of this new technology, which everyone's rushing to do, right? How are we going to use AI for our military? How are we going to use 3D printing to print weapons in theatre?
How do you use this technology? Yeah, and it's often framed as sort of AI for good, or, you know, blockchain for good. But yeah, how do you frame it in this disarmament scenario?
And what's fascinating about the Vatican context is they're not a bunch of tech bros. You know, they're people who think that technology impacts real human beings' lives, and therefore that the church should have a position on it. I should clarify, I'm not religious, I'm not Catholic. They just reached out to me because of my work. But they believe that the Pope Francis believes that they need to meet people where they are. That is, that in lives which are infused with technology and affected by technology. And so they need to be able to reach out to people spiritually in that world that they live in. And so their idea is, how can we take all of these new technologies and turn them towards human flourishing and what they call integral human development, where you develop not just the economy or not just the mind, but the spirit and community and collective security and collective environmental integrity. And so they reached out to me, and so I will be doing a lot of work with them, including further developing ideas around blockchain and a little teaser. We've started looking at the concept of NFTs as well, and where that sits in this whole kind of potential
intriguing
for
disarmament and NFTs.
Watch this space.
Watch this space. That's excellent place to end. Lyndon Burford, look, thanks for it. It's been a fascinating conversation. I think you're doing amazing work. Really advancing this cause of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. It's been a pleasure to talk to you this morning. Thanks very much for your time.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks very much, Ben.